It was a cold, rainy night as Dr. James Carter drove through the nearly empty streets of the city, heading home after a long, exhausting shift at the hospital. The rain beat heavily against his windshield, the rhythmic swiping of the wipers doing little to clear the steady downpour. He had performed 2 surgeries that day, both successful, yet draining, and his mind was set on finally getting home to unwind. As a renowned surgeon with decades of experience, James was no stranger to the stress of his profession, but tonight he felt particularly worn down. The streets were mostly deserted, lit only by the occasional streetlight that cast long shadows across the slick pavement. His mind wandered briefly to the comfort of his warm house, a hot cup of tea, and a quiet evening. But something was gnawing at him, a lingering feeling that wouldn't quite let go. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the silence in the car, but a sense of unease hovered around him, as if the night held something unexpected. Suddenly, something caught his eye. Just ahead, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, was a figure lying on the sidewalk, motionless and small. His heart raced as his instincts kicked in. He immediately slowed down, his mind sharpening with focus. He knew the dangers of this area of the city, especially at night. Pulling his car to a stop near the curb, James grabbed his medical kit from the passenger seat and hurried toward the figure. As he approached, the scene became clear. It was a young girl, no older than 10 or 11, sprawled out on the cold, wet ground. Her face was pale, her clothes dirty and torn, and a small stream of blood ran from a gash on her forehead. She was unconscious, her tiny frame vulnerable against the harsh elements of the night. Without hesitation, James knelt beside her, feeling the rain soak through his coat and drip down the back of his neck. None of it mattered. Years of experience took over as he quickly assessed her condition. His fingers found her pulse, weak but present. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Relief flooded through him, but he knew this was just the beginning. The wound on her forehead needed immediate attention, and there was no telling if she had other internal injuries. He carefully opened his medical kit, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. His hands, though tired from the long day, moved with the precision and calm that had defined his career. As he cleaned and dressed the wound, his eyes caught a glint of something metallic in her hand. She was clutching a small locket, a simple silver heart-shaped pendant worn with age. Despite her unconscious state, her grip on the locket was firm, as if it held something deeply personal, something she couldn't let go of. James felt a pang of sadness as he looked at the girl. She was so young, alone on the streets at night, injured and vulnerable. He couldn't help but wonder where her family was, why she was out here, and what had happened to her. But there was no time for those questions now. His priority was to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. Once he had stabilized her as best he could on the street, James carefully lifted her in his arms. She was light, her head resting against his chest, as the rain continued to fall around them. He quickly moved toward his car, shielding her as much as he could from the downpour. Gently, he laid her down on the back seat, ensuring she was secure before rushing to the driver's seat. The hospital wasn't far, but every second felt like an eternity. As he drove through the rain-slicked streets, his mind raced with possibilities. What had caused her injury? Had she been in an accident, or worse, had someone hurt her? The thought of the latter made his stomach churn. Whoever this girl was, she didn't deserve to be in this situation. James glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the unconscious girl in the back seat. Her small frame seemed even smaller in the dim light of the car, her face pale and expressionless, except for the locket, which still glinted faintly in her hand. The sight of it filled him with a strange sense of urgency, a feeling that this was no ordinary case, that there was more to this girl than met the eye. As the hospital came into view, James felt a rush of adrenaline. He pulled into the emergency entrance and called for help. Nurses and staff immediately rushed out with a gurney, and together they carefully lifted the girl from the car. As they wheeled her into the emergency room, James briefed his colleagues on her condition, explaining what little he knew. The ER doors swung open, and the girl was whisked away into the bright, sterile environment of the hospital, leaving James standing in the cold, wet night, his clothes soaked through. He watched as the doors closed behind her, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He had done everything he could for now, but the mystery of who she was and what had happened still gnawed at him. The locket, too, remained in his mind, a small, seemingly insignificant detail that felt strangely important. As he stood there, rain dripping from his hair and running down his face, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had found her, saved her life, but something told him there was much more to this story than a simple rescue. And whatever it was, he was now a part of it. The hospital was abuzz with the usual hum of late-night emergencies, but Dr. James Carter's mind was singularly focused on the unconscious girl now being wheeled into surgery. As the gurney rolled down the hallway, nurses and other doctors fell into their usual efficient routines, asking questions and preparing the operating room. But for James, the urgency was personal. Something about this girl had gripped him from the moment he found her on the street. He didn't know her name, her story, or why she was there, but she was now his responsibility, and her fate rested in his hands. The bright lights of the operating room were a stark contrast to the rain-soaked street he had just left behind. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the sharp, clinical sounds of heart monitors and clinking surgical instruments. He scrubbed in quickly, barely noticing the exhaustion creeping into his bones. His colleagues glanced at him, recognizing the urgency in his expression. The girl's body lay motionless on the operating table, her small frame dwarfed by the surrounding machines and equipment. Her clothes had been cut away, revealing the full extent of her injuries. The gash on her forehead was deep, but worse, there were internal injuries that needed immediate attention, likely from some sort of blunt trauma. James took a deep breath, steadying himself for the task ahead. "Let's get her stabilized," he ordered, his voice calm but firm, masking the tension building inside him. The team responded quickly, working with the practiced precision of seasoned professionals. IVs were inserted, vitals were monitored, and the anesthesia flowed. As the girl drifted deeper into unconsciousness, James focused on the delicate work of saving her life. The next hours passed in a blur of concentration and meticulous effort. Every suture, every movement of his hands was a battle to keep her alive. Throughout the surgery, the image of the locket remained lodged in his mind. He remembered the way she clutched it, even in her unconscious state. Something about that tiny piece of jewelry felt like a lifeline, a tether to her past, a sign that there was more to this girl's story than a random accident. But now was not the time to dwell on questions. Now he had to finish the job. As the surgery progressed, the tension in the room began to ease. The internal bleeding was controlled, and her vitals started to stabilize. Slowly, the reality set in. He was going to save her. Relief mingled with exhaustion as James worked through the final steps of the operation, stitching up the last of her wounds. His hands, though steady, felt heavy, the weight of the night pressing down on him. When the surgery was finally over, James stepped back, pulling his mask down and taking a deep breath. The girl was stable, her condition no longer life-threatening. She would need time to recover, but she would live. The other doctors and nurses began cleaning up, removing their gloves and masks, and filing out of the room one by one. James lingered, staring at the small figure on the table. Her face, now cleaned of blood, was pale and peaceful. She looked so fragile, yet there was a strength in her survival that James couldn't ignore. He felt a deep sense of responsibility toward her, not just as her surgeon, but as the one who had found her, who had brought her back from the brink of death. As he walked out of the operating room and into the hallway, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving him physically and emotionally drained. The hospital corridor was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes in the middle of the night. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying to shake the exhaustion that clung to him. But despite his fatigue, his mind wouldn't rest. The girl's face, the locket, the rain-slicked street, they all played over and over again in his head. James made his way to the staff locker room, hoping to find a moment to gather his thoughts. He stripped off his scrubs and changed back into his street clothes, the fabric of his shirt feeling rough against his skin. Every muscle in his body ached, but it was the mental exhaustion that weighed heaviest on him. He had saved lives before, countless times, but this felt different. As he stood in front of the mirror, splashing cold water on his face, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over. There was something about this girl that lingered, a sense that her story was far from finished. He thought about her injuries, The way she had been lying on that street, alone, hurt, with no one around to help her. Where had she come from? Who had hurt her? And why was she holding on to that locket so tightly, as if it were the only thing that mattered? James dried his face with a towel and took a deep breath. The logical part of him wanted to go home, to collapse into bed and sleep off the exhaustion. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to become a doctor in the first place, wouldn't let him leave it at that. He needed to know more. He needed to find out who this girl was and why she had ended up in his life. As he walked out of the locker room and into the main hospital lobby, the sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty space. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle outside, and the clock on the wall told him it was well past midnight. Still, James knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose threads. He glanced at the reception desk, where a nurse was typing notes into a computer. She looked up as he approached. "Keep me updated on her condition," he said, his voice quieter now, the weight of the night settling into his bones. The nurse nodded, offering a small smile of reassurance. But James knew that nothing would ease his mind until he had answers. With one last look down the hallway toward the operating room, he turned and headed for the exit. The night wasn't over. Not for him. As he stepped out into the cool, damp air, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the streets slick and shining under the dim glow of the streetlights. He pulled his coat tighter around him, his thoughts still on the girl and her mysterious locket. The image of her small hand clutching the locket stayed with him as he walked to his car. It felt like a clue, a tiny piece of the puzzle that had yet to be solved. And James knew, deep down, that he wasn't just a doctor who had saved a girl tonight. He was part of her story now, and her story was far from over. The drive home was a blur of rain-soaked streets, darkened buildings, and the faint hum of the radio in the background. Dr. James Carter, though physically present behind the wheel, felt as though he were still back in the operating room. The image of the young girl lying on the cold pavement burned into his mind. Her fragile form, the blood staining her clothes, and, most haunting of all, the silver locket she had clutched so tightly. He gripped the steering wheel harder, his knuckles white under the dim light of the dashboard. The rain had slowed, but the steady rhythm of the drops hitting the windshield created a hypnotic pulse, matching the beat of his racing thoughts. Every time he blinked, he saw her, unconscious, alone, and so painfully vulnerable. A girl who couldn't be more than 15, left to die on the streets. How had she gotten there? What was her story? And why did he feel such a deep connection to her? By the time James pulled into his driveway, his mind was swirling with questions and exhaustion. His modest home, usually a haven of peace, felt oppressive tonight. As he parked the car and stepped out into the cool night air, he felt the weight of the evening settle deeper into his bones. The tiredness wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a fatigue born from the burdens he carried as a doctor, the lives he held in his hands every day. He made his way up the front steps, rain still clinging to his coat, and unlocked the door. The quiet of his house greeted him, as it always did at this hour. No sounds of family or conversation, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock on the wall. The silence was usually a comfort after the chaos of the hospital, but tonight it felt suffocating. James flicked on a lamp in the living room, casting a warm glow over the space. He shrugged off his coat, draped it over a chair, and sank into the worn leather of his favorite armchair. His body ached with the need for rest, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. He reached for the glass of water he had left on the side table earlier that day, taking a long sip as he stared out the rain-splattered window. The world outside was dark, the night still heavy with rain clouds, but all he could see was the girl, the pale face, the wounds, and that locket, gleaming even through the chaos. Why did she clutch it so tightly? What did it mean to her? A family heirloom? A gift? He wondered if it held the key to understanding who she was and how she ended up in his life. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair, trying to let the exhaustion overtake him. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he came close to drifting off, his mind jerked awake, fixated on the unanswered questions. Then his phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the stillness of the room, and for a moment, James didn't move. He didn't want to pick it up. He didn't want to hear more bad news. But instinct kicked in, and before he could think about it, he reached for the phone, his heart already sinking with the knowledge that this wouldn't be a normal call. "Doctor, Carter," he answered, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "Doctor, it's Nurse Kelly from the hospital. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but we've had some updates on the girl you brought in." James sat up straighter, his grip tightening around the phone. "How is she?" There was a pause, the kind of hesitation that only came with difficult news. "She's stable, but her condition is still critical. We've run some tests and, well, it's worse than we initially thought. She suffered significant trauma, not just physically, but emotionally. It seems like this wasn't an accident. There's evidence of prolonged abuse." James felt the breath leave his body, as if the weight of the revelation had knocked the wind out of him. He had suspected something dark, but to hear it confirmed, it was more than he had prepared for. "The police are getting involved," Nurse Kelly continued. "They're trying to piece together what happened, but there's very little information. The girl, her name is Sophie, by the way, doesn't have any ID on her. Just that locket." "Sophie," James whispered the name, finally giving identity to the girl who had haunted his thoughts all night. But the name only made her story more tragic, more real. "There's something else," Kelly added, her voice softer now. "We managed to trace the locket. It belonged to her mother, who passed away a few years ago. Sophie's been living on the streets ever since, in and out of foster care. The authorities don't know much, but it seems like she's been running for a while. Whoever hurt her, they've been looking for her." James's heart sank even further. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was her last connection to her mother, her last tie to the family she had lost. And now she had no one. "I'll be in first thing in the morning," James said, his voice firm despite the emotional toll of the conversation. He had saved Sophie's life, but her story was far from over. And now he felt a responsibility that went beyond the operating room. As he hung up the phone, James leaned forward in his chair, his hands covering his face. The exhaustion, the helplessness, the anger, it all hit him at once. Sophie wasn't just another patient. She was a child who had been abandoned by the system, by the people who were supposed to protect her. And now she was alone, clutching a locket that held all her memories of a life that had been ripped away from her. James stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake the frustration that burned inside him. He wanted to help her, to do more than just fix her physical wounds. He wanted to find out who had done this to her, to ensure she wouldn't go back to the life that had nearly killed her. But how? He was just a doctor, a surgeon who had stumbled upon her by chance. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe it wasn't chance at all. Maybe he had been meant to find her that night, meant to be the one who could give her a second chance. As the night stretched on, James's mind raced with possibilities, with plans. He wasn't going to let Sophie fall through the cracks again. He wasn't going to let her be forgotten. He had saved her life once, and he was going to make sure she had a future worth living. And as the rain continued to fall outside, James made a silent vow to himself and to the girl he barely knew. He would be her protector, her advocate. He would fight for her, just as he had fought to save her life on that operating table. The morning sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds as Dr. James Carter arrived at the hospital, his mind still buzzing with the events of the previous night. The image of Sophie, no, Emily now, as he learned, clutching that delicate silver locket, wouldn't leave him. He had saved her life physically, but the scars she carried went far beyond the ones his scalpel could heal. He knew that today he needed answers. Stepping through the hospital doors, the sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the familiar bustle of nurses and doctors greeted him. Yet amidst the daily rush of his profession, his focus was entirely on the fragile girl who lay in the recovery room. He had pieced together fragments of her story from Nurse Kelly's late-night call, but so much was still unknown. James made his way down the corridor, the echo of his footsteps punctuating the silence in his mind. When he arrived at the nurse's station, Nurse Kelly was already there, her face as grim as it had been the night before. "Dr. Carter, good morning," she said, but her tone carried no joy. She nodded toward the patient file resting on the counter. "Her name is Emily Dawson, 15 years old. There's more in her file, and the social worker is here to speak with you." James took the file in his hands, the weight of it feeling heavier than usual. He glanced through the first few pages, details of her injuries, the emergency procedures he had performed the night before, and then the history of her fragile existence. Abuse, neglect, foster care, and finally the streets. It was a brutal read, and with each new line, his heart broke a little more for the girl who had somehow endured all this. "Where is she?" James asked quietly, his voice tight. "She's in the recovery room," Kelly replied. "Still unconscious, but stable. Dr. Weston's team will be monitoring her closely." James gave a slight nod before walking towards the small consultation room where the social worker was waiting. The walls of the room felt too close, as if the gravity of Emily's situation had shrunk the space around him. Inside, a young woman in her late 20s, wearing a navy blazer and glasses, stood up to greet him. "Dr. Carter, I'm Amanda Lewis, Emily Dawson's assigned social worker." She introduced herself, her hand extended for a brief shake. Her face was serious, yet compassionate, a look James had grown accustomed to over the years working alongside social workers. "Please sit," Amanda gestured, her eyes scanning his face as if to gauge his emotional state. "I imagine last night was difficult for you." James sat across from her, Emily's file resting on the table between them. "You could say that. I need to understand more about her. How did she end up here? Why was she alone, injured, and on the streets?" Amanda took a deep breath, her gaze softening. "Emily's been in and out of foster care for most of her life. Her father, if you can call him that, was an abusive alcoholic. Her mother passed away when she was very young, and Emily was left in the care of that monster." She paused for a moment, her voice trembling ever so slightly, and then continued. "After years of neglect and abuse, she finally ran away at 13. She's been on the streets ever since." James's heart sank deeper with every word. It was worse than he had feared. No child should have to suffer through such trauma, and yet here she was, still fighting for her life, her spirit unbroken, despite the horrors she had faced. "She's incredibly resilient," Amanda added. "She survived 2 winters on the streets, somehow evading the worst dangers out there. She kept herself alive by scavenging, avoiding shelters for fear of being found. And that locket, it's her only keepsake from her mother. It's the one thing she refuses to part with." James's mind flashed back to the silver locket, now safely stored in the hospital's personal belongings room. A tiny, delicate thing, holding all the weight of Emily's shattered past. He clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering at the thought of all she had endured. But he knew anger wasn't enough. He needed to take action. "What happens now?" James asked, his voice low and measured. "What's her future going to look like?" Amanda leaned forward slightly, her hands folded together. "That's up to her, Dr. Carter. But it's not looking good. She's a runaway with no stable family, no resources, and no one to advocate for her. The state will probably place her back into the system once she recovers. But you and I both know that the foster system is broken. Children like Emily, they fall through the cracks." James's jaw tightened. He had seen this too many times. Kids like Emily, lost in the shuffle, passed from one temporary home to another, never finding stability, never receiving the help they truly needed. He stood up suddenly, the decision forming in his mind before he even realized it. "I want to help her," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Amanda blinked, slightly surprised. "Help her? How?" "I don't know yet," James admitted, his brow furrowing in thought. "But I can't just let her go back into the system and fall through those cracks. She deserves a chance, a real chance. And if I have the means to do something, then I will." Amanda watched him carefully, her eyes softening as she nodded in understanding. "It's admirable, Dr. Carter. But helping Emily isn't just about saving her life physically. She's been through hell. She's going to need emotional support, counseling, a stable home. This won't be easy." "I'm aware of that," James replied. "But I've seen what happens when kids like her don't get the support they need. I'm not letting that happen. She's strong, but she's been carrying this weight alone for far too long. She needs someone in her corner." Amanda smiled faintly, her admiration for the doctor growing. "Well, I can help you navigate the system, but you'll need to be prepared for a fight. Bureaucracy, legal hurdles. It's going to take time. James nodded. I've spent my whole life fighting to save people's lives. I'm ready for this. The months following Emily's surgery were transformative for both her and Dr. James Carter. What began as a late-night rescue had turned into a journey of healing, hope, and redemption. Emily had come a long way from the broken girl he found on the street, and as she lay recovering in the hospital room, her small figure curled beneath a thin white blanket. The weight of her past seemed to slowly peel away. Her recovery was gradual, her body healing from the physical trauma of the injuries, but the scars left by her past abuse and life on the streets would take longer to mend. Dr. Carter visited her daily, at first just to check on her medical progress, but over time, those visits became about something much deeper. He would sit by her bedside, offering encouragement, bringing books or puzzles to pass the time, and listening whenever Emily was ready to speak. At first, she was quiet, her eyes always cast downward, as if afraid to meet his gaze. But slowly, day by day, a change began to stir in her. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, and one day, she finally opened up. I didn't think anyone would care if I didn't make it, Emily said softly, her voice barely audible over the beeping of the heart monitor beside her. She was staring out the window, her hand absent-mindedly playing with the now-repaired locket that hung around her neck. Dr. Carter, seated in the chair beside her bed, felt a lump rise in his throat. That's not true, Emily. You matter more than you know, and I care. I always will. She turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. There was a vulnerability there, but also a glimmer of hope, a spark of life returning to her. She didn't respond, but that look spoke volumes. As the weeks passed, Emily's recovery continued, and so did the growing bond between her and Dr. Carter. Once she was strong enough to leave the hospital, James made sure she had a place to go. Working closely with the hospital's social services department, they secured a small apartment for her in a transitional housing program. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but it was clean, safe, and most importantly, hers. On the day of her discharge, Dr. Carter stood outside the hospital entrance with Emily, the sun shining down on them, a symbol of the fresh start that lay ahead. Emily held a small duffel bag with her few possessions, her hand still clutching the locket as if it were her lifeline. She was wearing simple clothes, a pair of jeans and a hoodie, her face free of the worry lines that had once marked her. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. For everything. You don't need to thank me, James replied, his eyes soft with kindness. Just promise me one thing. Never give up on yourself. You've been through more than anyone should, but you've made it through. You're stronger than you know. Emily's lip quivered as she tried to hold back tears. For the first time in what felt like years, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and given her hope. I promise, she whispered. Life for Emily was no longer about mere survival. With Dr. Carter's help, she was enrolled in a local school, where she began to catch up on the education she had missed. It wasn't easy at first. Her confidence was shaky, and she struggled with feelings of inadequacy, especially after being out of the system for so long. But Dr. Carter, always a phone call away, became more than just her doctor. He became her mentor. On weekends, he would meet her at a small cafe near her apartment. They would sit together over cups of tea or coffee, discussing her progress in school, her future dreams, and how to navigate the challenges she faced. The first time Emily shared her dream of becoming a nurse, Dr. Carter felt his heart swell with pride. I want to help people like you helped me, she had said, her voice tentative but filled with resolve. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one cares. I want to make sure no one ever feels that way again. Hearing those words, James realized that Emily's resilience had transformed into something truly remarkable. Compassion. She wasn't just healing, she was blossoming into someone who would one day make a difference in others' lives, just as he had for her. As the months passed, Emily's life continued to improve. She excelled in school, finding solace in her studies, and forming friendships for the first time in years. She began volunteering at the hospital on weekends, shadowing nurses and learning the basics of patient care. She still clutched the locket from time to time, a reminder of her past and her mother, but now it was less a symbol of pain and more of a memory of love, something she would carry forward into her new life. Dr. Carter, watching from a distance, knew that his journey with Emily was far from over. He had made a profound difference in her life, but she had done something even more important. She had reignited his sense of purpose. For years, he had been a surgeon, saving lives through his hands and skill. But with Emily, he had saved a soul, giving her not just a second chance at life, but a reason to live it fully. It wasn't long before Dr. Carter's act of kindness grew beyond just Emily. Inspired by her transformation, he began speaking at medical conferences, advocating for stronger support systems for homeless and runaway children. He started a foundation in Emily's name, funding scholarships for foster children and runaway teens, providing them with the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. As for Emily, she continued on her path toward becoming a nurse, driven by the kindness she had received and the desire to pay it forward. She knew her story wasn't over, and with every day that passed, she moved closer to her dreams. One day, as she stood in the hospital where it all began, watching Dr. Carter speak at the opening of a new wing dedicated to providing care for underprivileged children, Emily smiled. She realized that the life she had once thought was lost had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.